see all of you, and you guys can still see the screen if that works for you. Yeah, and no one else will be in the video like that. Everybody's okay with that. So, yeah, so good afternoon, and thanks for joining me. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the Bindal and Wugurukabas peoples as the traditional custodians of the land, and further acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded, and that dispossession and exploitation are still ongoing processes relevant to today. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, and the chain of argument goes like this. And by the way, this presentation is based on a paper that is under review, and I'm eagerly waiting for a few months to see what the reviewers think. So you guys are actually going to be my first reviewers, so I'm curious to see in the discussion how it goes. But the argument goes like this. Rights are essential to citizenship, this concept of rights, and that citizenship rights are based on legal rights. I'll get to that. And that these legal rights are usually based on laws that are made by humans rather than laws that are discovered by humans, and I'll unpack that. But I'm going to argue that the laws that are made by humans should be subordinate to the laws that are discovered by humans, and I'll argue that and unpack that as well. And that therefore there are certain citizenship rights, which I call eco-citizenship rights, and their matching responsibilities, that should be based on the most important laws discovered by humans through modern science, and which describe fundamental limits to the world. That concept of limits is really important. And finally, that understanding the whole chain of argument requires education, or namely what I'm calling eco-citizenship education. So that's an overview. Okay, so let's make a start. So, as I said, so when discussing citizenship, rights are a central concept. Now, in terms of modern citizenship rights, in Marshall's classic essay, Citizenship and Social Class, he described their historical and hierarchical, I'm going to describe it as hierarchical development as first civil rights, and then political rights, and then finally social or socioeconomic rights. So in other words, civil rights are the foundation of citizenship rights. Now in turn, on the opening pages of his essay, Marshall himself stated that, quote, "The institutions most directly associated with the foundation with civil rights are the courts of justice," which is a canonical legal institution. And so we can say, as some authors do, like Janowski and Grand, who I've got in my references at the end, we can say that civil rights are basically a synonym for legal rights. And so all citizenship rights in this sense are based on and secured by legal rights. So for example, Australia is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 6, subsection 1 says that every human being has the inherent right to life, and this right shall be protected by law, unquote. Okay, now, in the ensuing decades, there have been many criticisms of Marshall's essay for ignoring gender and race and questions about its international applicability. But for my purpose, what's important is that all of the rights that Marshall described have something in common, and that is that they're all based on laws that are made by humans. Okay, so I'm going to talk about jurisprudence now for a moment. Jurisprudence is a fancy word for the philosophy of law. Right? Jurisprudence distinguishes between just what I was talking about, distinguishes between laws that are made by humans, which it calls positive laws, and laws that are discovered by humans, which it calls natural law. Now, jurisprudence goes back many centuries. Law was one of the few subjects that you could study in a medieval university. And so this distinction between positive law and natural law has a long history. Now, traditionally, those laws that were discovered by humans were based on a process of introspection and moral reasoning. I'll give some examples. So for example, Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century in the Leviathan, he discovered through introspection that everyone has a natural right to what he called self-preservation. They all have a natural right to life, to their life. And he therefore concluded that this must be a natural law, meaning that anyone would come to this conclusion if they followed this same process of reasoning. Now in this time, God was often invoked to authorize these natural laws. And so therefore, these natural laws were held to be superior. God's laws were held to be superior to any laws that humans could make. And so a primary concern of jurisprudence was to determine if and under what conditions these laws that we make are based on those superior laws that we discover. That was a big, an enduring consideration in jurisprudence. Okay. Now, with the onset of industrialization, the study of natural law declined in the 18th century, and it fell into abeyance in the 19th century. But in recent decades, it has been revived and modernized via what's called the earth jurisprudence. And earth jurisprudence, like its traditional cousin, also aims to base laws that are made by humans on those discovered by humans, but it aims to modernize the concept of natural law so that so that it encompasses all the natural laws that are based on those of modern science, these laws that we discovered through modern science. Okay, now to draw this back to the main argument, so what is the implication of this for citizenship rights? Well, if you think back to this hierarchy of an historical development of citizenship rights that's founded upon legal ones. So what I'm arguing is that citizenship rights are based on positive law right now, like this right to life that I mentioned, but there should be some legal rights that are based on natural laws that we discover through modern science. Now, how does this argument, or how might this argument hold up without God being invoked to authorize these natural laws? In other words, why should natural laws discovered through modern science be considered superior to those positive laws that we make? Well, I think in responding to this question, I think simply because humans can choose to make any laws that they want, and those laws vary according to time and place and culture and custom. And similarly, humans can choose to break any of those laws that they make. Now, on the other hand, there's no such variation in natural laws. They rise to a much higher standard of universalism, and also we have no such choice when it comes to breaking natural laws, like Newton's law of gravity, which is what's shown on the bottom here. We can't just say, oh, I don't like Newton's law of gravity, I'm going to break the law and float away. It doesn't work like that. Now, on the other hand, no matter how important we consider this example that I gave, our right to life, unfortunately, these laws protecting people's right to life are broken all the time. People get killed all the time. And so by further comparison, while introspection led Hobbes to this moral conclusions that natural law authorizes everyone's right to life, outward-looking and empirical methods led Newton to certain factual conclusions, like we say Newton's laws of motion. I say Newton in scare quotes because we say that Newton discovered this law of gravity rather than made the law of gravity. And so, whereas Hobbes' moral reasoning applied only to humans and could be extended to other living things on Earth, it has, for example, little relevance on Neptune or anywhere else in the universe, whereas Newton's laws of motion apply to any two bodies in the universe. And in fact, Newton's laws of motion were used to predict the existence of Neptune. The reference for that is also in the references at the end. Okay, so that's the argument for the superiority of these natural laws over positive laws. And given this argument, and this priority or superiority of natural laws over positive ones, I think it stands to reason that there ought to be certain citizenship rights that are authorized by natural laws too. I'm going to make the argument more specific now. So I'm going to bring the argument to bear on the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which, quoting Robert Ayres, he calls are the most important laws of nature. These most important laws of nature discovered through modern science. So what are these laws? Okay, so both of these laws, by the way, involve the concept of energy, which is the fundamental quantity needed to do anything, right? Okay, so what are the laws? So the first law is that energy is always conserved. Energy is always conserved. It cannot be created or destroyed, and only transferred and transformed. And as a science teacher, you recognize we teach this in year 9 and 10, and this is something that all students will learn. Okay, so, and just as a brief aside, if we just think about, hope this is not stretching it too far, but if you just think about Einstein's famous E equals mc squared, where E is the energy and m is the matter, there's an interconvertibility between energy and matter. C squared is a constant, and so we can say that energy and matter are conserved together. And so basically what the first law does is it limits how much energy and matter there is in a system, or more colloquially, it limits how much stuff there is. Right? There's a limit to how much stuff there is. Okay, so for example, the Earth has a finite mass, and the sun emits a finite amount of energy. Okay, that's the first law. What about the second law? So thermodynamics is concerned with what it calls spontaneous processes. Spontaneous is basically a synonym for natural processes, right? So for example, heat always flows spontaneously from a hot body to a cool one, and never in reverse. Now, of course, heat can be made to flow in reverse. That's what a fridge does. But the creation of these devices requires an external source of energy, and these devices have only ever been able to convert that external energy source partially into useful work, with the rest being wasted as heat. And so basically, what the second law limits is the efficiency of energy transfers, and it rules out the perfect recycling of energy. And more generally, it says that the useful energy in an isolated system is always diminishing. Okay, I hope that's not too technical, but that's quite big, the second law of thermodynamics. But that's, I hope in a nutshell, it's clear enough. But so for example, Earth is not an isolated system, but its external energy from the sun is limited by the first law itself, like I mentioned before. Okay, so those are these two fundamental limits. There's a limit to how much stuff there is in a system, wherever you want to draw the boundaries, and there's a limit also to how efficiently you can use that stuff. Now, what are the implications of these natural laws and limits for citizenship rights? Okay, well, with these natural laws and limits in view, let's apply them to the prefix eco. Okay, now usually when we think of eco something, we think of ecology, right? Like the natural environment. We talk about something that's eco-friendly, or we talk about ecofeminism or ecotourism. We think of the natural world, right? But the same prefix eco is also used in the word economy. Now, Robert Costanza and his associates a while back wrote a book chapter giving an account of the overlapping history between ecology and economy, revealing their common source, their eventual divergence, and then their subsequent reunion in the current transdisciplinary field called ecological economics. And the primary goal of ecological economics is called sustainable scale, and it aims to keep humans' collective use of resources, matter and energy resources, within the Earth's natural limits. And I just, as an aside, just in case it wasn't super clear, from the scientific or physicist conception, matter and energy exhaust the physicist's ontology. Everything that is said to exist is one form or the other, or both. So everything that exists is one or the other. And it has these laws that are limiting how much of it there is and how efficiently we can use it. Okay, so ecological economists, and I too elsewhere, have argued that economic growth increases our use of material and energy resources, which looks like this. So as the economy grows, it expands into the surrounding ecosystem, and it degrades their functionality as it does so. And every country that I have ever looked at in the world is dedicated to growing the economy. Now, on the other hand, in relation to this, ecological sustainability, which is what I'm depicting on the right, requires some collective limitation on energy and matter resources, which looks like this. And I want to just highlight that in the left situation, whereas there's an increase in the quantity of matter and energy as the economy grows, which every country is dedicated to doing, in the situation on the right, there's a quantitative limit on the amount of energy that we're using, but that does not rule out qualitative changes in the material output of the economy, which is represented by this changes of color here in material output. And those qualitative changes could be changes in information and education, changes in technological development, could be changes in fashion and culture, changes in income and wealth distribution, and so on. All of those things are commensurate with ecological sustainability, provided that there is some collective limit on the matter and energy that we are using, which is not happening, by the way, at all. Every year it just keeps going up, like this situation on the left, which is very intentional. Okay, so the prefix eco and this conflict between economic growth and ecological sustainability is thus the focal point of eco-citizenship, where this prefix eco subsumes this conflict between economic growth and ecological sustainability. In one case, it involves increasing the material and energy. In another case, it involves limiting the material and energy. All right. So with this conflict between economic growth and ecological sustainability in view, as well as these thermodynamic laws and limits, thank you, that I mentioned, I think it stands to reason that these natural laws and limits authorize eco-citizens' natural right and responsibility to collectively limit our resource use, which, as I mentioned, is not currently happening. Rather, every year our collective use of materials and energy grows, and the state of the environment continues to decline as a result. So, to make these natural rights and responsibilities clear, it's important to distinguish between natural limits, which is what I was talking about before, and what I'm going to call sustainable limits. I'll say something just briefly about those. So natural limits are those which require no intent or effort to uphold on our part. They cannot be avoided or changed or broken. These natural limits are being manifested in things like biodiversity loss, pollution buildup, climate change, and so on. Now, sustainable limits, on the other hand, are those which do require humans' effort and intention and understanding in order to uphold them. And they are necessarily less than natural limits. And just as an aside, the gap between these natural limits and sustainable limits in ecological economics, they call this slack, right? We want to leave lots of slack in the system so that if we don't get too close to what the natural limit is. That's the idea. Okay, so this brings me to my final slide then on eco-citizenship education. So this natural right and responsibility of eco-citizenship is the collective imposition of limits on resource use, in line, like with what I said before, on these most important natural laws, those of thermodynamics, what I described, and the limits that they set. But as I just noted, keeping our use of resources within the sustainable limits requires education of these interdependencies, the interdependent concepts, beginning with, okay, there are these natural laws, they set limits, and then therefore we have a natural right and a natural responsibility to act in a way which is commensurate with those. Now, in his classic essay, The Two Cultures, C.P. Snow argued that it's only through appropriate education that people can be expected to understand the second law of thermodynamics, much less use it as the basis for a natural responsibility and related social movement. But this, I'm arguing, this eco-citizenship education must become paramount if we're going to create what Engin Issen has called a planetary movement needed to avert further ecosystem decline and eventual collapse and allow Earth's natural systems to recover. Okay, so just quickly to summarize, so as I said, so citizenship rights are fundamentally legal concepts and they're based on legal rights. Those legal rights are usually based on laws that are made by humans rather than those that are discovered by humans. But those natural laws are superior to those made by humans in the sense that we can't break those laws, right? And so there, again, I think it stands to reason, so that there are certain natural rights, which I'm calling eco-citizenship rights, and they're matching natural responsibilities based on the most important natural laws, which I described before, those of thermodynamics, and the fundamental limits to the world that they set. And finally, understanding this whole chain of reasoning and making it the basis of a planetary movement or a social movement requires education, what I'm calling eco-citizenship education. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Those are my references. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And just as a segue to the discussion in question, am I on time? How
lunch is at 5, but we can take about 5 minutes,
yeah.
But,
okay.
Feel free to,
Okay, we have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
But just as a segue to like question and discussion is, like as a teacher myself, I think like some of the things that I talked about, we're already teaching in schools anyway. I mean, David, you mentioned that you're a science teacher, a medical practitioner. I mean,
medical science teacher.
Medical science teacher. But for me as a science teacher, like we already teach some of these things in schools, like the first law of thermodynamics. We do that in year 9 or year 10 science. So, but I think a part of what this eco-citizenship education needs to do is to be more holistic and relational in connecting these things together, rather than just, okay, the kids go to whereas traditionally schools, especially in high school, are very compartmentalized. They go to science and they just learn that, but it's not, I think it needs to be, that for example, needs to be connected to what they study in legal studies and what they study in geography, and of course, what they study, if they study it at all, in civics and citizenship education. So anyway, questions, comments, discussion? Yeah, yes.
Super interesting.